I sat in the lobby of the Seabreeze Hotel, the polished marble floor gleaming under the soft light of the chandeliers. My suitcase rested at my feet like a loyal companion, the only one who hadn't abandoned me. My name is Evelyn Hartman. I'm 73 years old, and last night my family walked out of this hotel without me. They didn't even bother to wake me. They simply packed their things, settled their bills, and left me behind as though I were a piece of luggage they no longer needed to carry. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they had gone for an early breakfast or a walk on the beach. But when I asked the woman at the front desk, she looked at me with pity in her eyes and said, "Mrs. Hartman, your children checked out at sunrise." A note had been left for me, one line scribbled hastily on hotel stationery. "Mom, we'll call you later." That was it. No explanation, no apology, just a dismissal that felt colder than the air-conditioned draft sweeping through the empty lobby. I had paid for this trip, every last detail of it. I booked the suites overlooking the ocean, arranged the dinners, even scheduled activities I thought the grandchildren would enjoy. I wanted to believe that bringing us all together under one roof might remind them of who we once were, a family bound by love, not by transactions. Instead, what I faced was silence, the hollow echo of heels clicking across marble, and the gnawing realization that my own children no longer saw me as their mother. I was a purse they could open when they wanted, and now apparently one they could walk away from when it no longer suited them. The weight of that truth settled over me, like the humid Florida air pressing against the glass doors. I stayed seated, clutching the note, as if it could explain what words had failed to. It didn't. All it did was remind me that something in us had broken beyond repair. And as I sat there abandoned in plain sight, I knew this trip would not end the way I had imagined. The idea for this trip had taken root months earlier in the quiet of my empty house. After my husband passed away, the rooms felt too large, the days too long. I wanted laughter back in my life, the sound of children running through hallways, the hum of family conversations around a dinner table. That longing is what drove me to plan a family vacation at Seabreeze, a place that promised both comfort and togetherness. I spared no expense, though my children didn't know that. The suites overlooked the shoreline where the Atlantic stretched endless and blue. I arranged dinner reservations at restaurants that served fresh-caught seafood, and I even booked a sailing excursion because I thought the grandchildren would love to feel the wind in their faces. I imagined us reconnecting like threads woven back into one strong fabric. When they arrived, there was that first spark of hope. The children hugged me. The grandchildren squealed with delight at the sight of the pool, and for a moment I believed I had done the right thing. We walked along the boardwalk that evening, the smell of salt water filling the air, and I thought maybe this was what we needed. But beneath those smiles, I sensed something I couldn't quite name. Richard kept glancing at his phone between conversations. Caroline's laughter seemed a little too practiced, and Daniel spoke mostly about business even when we were looking out over the water. Still, I brushed those feelings aside. I told myself I was overthinking, that I needed to stop doubting and let joy take its course. Yet even in that first night, as I watched them gather around a table I had set for us with such care, a thought lingered at the back of my mind. Had I brought them here to heal us, or had I simply given them another chance to measure what I was worth? The first dinner felt almost normal. We sat around a large table by the window, the ocean stretching out beyond the glass plates of shrimp and grouper arriving one after another. Conversation started light with the children asking about each other's lives, the grandchildren interrupting with stories from school. For a short while, I let myself breathe, believing that maybe this was what I had been missing all along. But before dessert arrived, the tone shifted. Richard leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine, and began talking about an expansion he wanted for his small logistics company. It could really take off with the right investment, he said, looking at me rather than his siblings. Caroline chimed in next, almost casually, about the rising interest rates and how a bigger home would be perfect for her growing family if only she could manage the down payment. Daniel, the youngest, smiled and slid into the conversation with ease. He spoke of a land parcel outside Orlando, something too good to pass up if he could just secure a partner to buy in with him. I listened quietly, nodding at the appropriate moments, but a cold weight began to settle in my stomach. This wasn't the talk of children eager to reconnect with their mother. It was the careful framing of proposals, each of them circling the same point without saying it outright. They wanted my money. I forced a smile and redirected the conversation to the grandchildren asking about their classes, their friends. For a moment, the table lightened again, but the undercurrent was there, steady and insistent. When we left the restaurant that night, I lingered by the railing overlooking the beach, the waves rolling in heavy and dark. The vacation had only just begun, and already I feared I knew where it was heading. 2 nights into our stay, I arranged a quiet dinner in one of the resort's finer restaurants. The room was intimate candlelight flickering against the polished wood, and I hoped the setting might invite real conversation. I wanted to hear about their lives beyond business plans, to remember the sound of their laughter when it wasn't tethered to strategy or gain. But when they arrived, my hope faltered. Richard carried his laptop bag, Caroline held a folder tucked under her arm, and Daniel followed with a tablet. They greeted me warmly enough, but there was an edge to their smiles, a rehearsed brightness that felt like the beginning of a performance. The waiter brought the first coarse-seared scallops with lemon butter, and before I could comment on the flavor, Richard opened his laptop. Charts glowed across the screen, and his voice shifted into the confident cadence of a salesman. Caroline followed, laying out numbers she had scrawled across notepaper, explaining mortgages and potential returns. Daniel slid his tablet across the table, a glossy photo of undeveloped land filling the screen. I sat in silence, the candlelight casting shadows across their faces, and realized this was no family dinner. This was a pitch meeting, and I was the investor they had come to impress. Their voices overlapped their gestures, animated, each competing for my attention, as if love could be tallied in percentages and profit margins. I set down my fork and let the noise wash over me. Finally, I spoke, my voice low but steady. Does anyone remember why I brought us here? The question landed heavy between us, and for the first time that evening, silence took hold. I sipped my water, feeling the hollowness grow inside me. By the next morning, I would understand just how far that emptiness could reach. The morning after that dinner, I slept later than usual. The night had drained me, and for once I allowed myself the indulgence of staying in bed past sunrise. When I finally dressed and made my way down to the lobby, I expected to see my family already gathering for breakfast. Perhaps the grandchildren tugging at their parents' sleeves, eager for pancakes. The lobby, however, was quiet, too quiet. No familiar voices, no suitcases by the couches, no children darting between chairs. At first I thought they had simply gone ahead without me, maybe to the cafe near the boardwalk. But when I asked the woman at the front desk, her expression softened with something that felt like pity. "Mrs. Hartman," she said gently, "your children checked out this morning very early, around 6. Her words didn't register at first. I stared at her as if she had misspoken, but then she slid a small folded slip of hotel stationery across the counter. In neat, hurried handwriting were 5 words, "Mom will call you later." That was all. No explanation, no invitation to meet them somewhere, no apology. Just a dismissal so brief it could have been mistaken for a reminder note. I held the paper between my fingers, the edges dampening with the sweat of my palm, and felt the floor shift beneath me. I sat down on one of the velvet chairs in the lobby, the kind meant for travelers passing time before their rides arrived. My suitcase was still in my room, but in that moment it felt as though everything I had built, everything I had believed in, had already been packed away and carried off without me. The air smelled faintly of citrus polish, the kind hotels use to disguise wear and age. I breathed it in, cold and sharp, and wondered if this was the scent of being discarded. I stayed in that lobby long after the other guests had come and gone, watching them wheel their luggage toward waiting cars, families laughing as they planned their next adventure. I must have looked like one of them at first glance, another traveler waiting to check out. But I wasn't waiting for anyone. The people I had brought here, the ones I thought were my reason for being, had already left me behind. The silence gave me space to think, and thinking brought memories I had long tried to bury. I saw myself in my 30s, juggling 2 jobs after my husband died, stretching every dollar to keep food on the table and tuition paid. I remembered the nights I stayed up until dawn working over contracts, the weekends I drove from one property to another, fixing leaks and painting walls myself when I couldn't afford to hire help. I built an empire out of sheer necessity, but I told myself it was for them, for the children who deserved stability, education, a future. Looking at that slip of paper in my hand, I wondered if they had ever seen any of it. Did Richard know that I sold my wedding ring once to pay for his first semester of college? Did Caroline realize that every recital dress she wore had been sewn late at night after I returned from meetings? Did Daniel ever think about the hours I spent teaching him how to negotiate, how to read the fine print? The truth pressed down on me harder than the Florida humidity. They hadn't come on this trip to remember or to thank me. They came to calculate, to measure what I was still worth to them in numbers, not in love. And sitting there with the note trembling in my fingers, I felt something within me shift. The wound of betrayal was raw, but beneath it, a colder clarity began to form. If I was nothing more than an open wallet to them, then maybe it was time I closed it. Back in my suite, the curtain still drawn against the sharp Florida sun, I sat at the desk with my laptop. For years, my computer had been the center of my empire, the place where I signed contracts, managed accounts, and tracked every property that kept our lives afloat. Tonight, it became the place where I faced a different kind of reckoning. I opened the files one by one, each document a reminder of decades of labor. Rental agreements, property deeds, investment accounts, all the fruits of my restless determination. My children had never seen these pages. They had only seen the results, the comforts and privileges that money provided. They never asked what it cost me, not in dollars, but in years. The cursor blinked on the screen, waiting for me to decide. For a long while, I simply stared at it, my hand trembling on the mouse. I thought of the other women I knew, widows like me, who spent their final years in assisted living, often forgotten by the very families they had raised. I thought of my neighbor who had been placed in a nursing home against her will, her pension swallowed by fees, while her children rarely visited. That image struck something deep inside me. If my own children saw me as nothing more than an account to be tapped, then I would not leave them the power to decide how my story ended. Instead, I would choose for myself. I began drafting a new plan, transferring the bulk of my estate into a foundation that would bear my late husband's name. A fund designed to support elderly men and women who, like me, had been overlooked, discarded, or betrayed by the people they trusted most. As the clock ticked past midnight, I pressed save, the decision etched into more than just documents. It was carved into the core of who I had become, no longer a provider to children who saw only numbers, but a guardian of dignity for those who had none. A week later, after I had returned home, I sent each of my children a letter. I chose paper and pen over email because I wanted the words to carry weight. In neat script, I explained that I had restructured my estate. The foundation in their father's name would receive the majority of my assets. They would not be cut out entirely, but the days of open checkbooks and endless rescues were over. The phone calls started almost immediately. Richard's voice was sharp-laced with anger. "You can't just decide this without talking to us. Do you realize what this does to my business plans?" Caroline cried over the line, her words tumbling out between sobs about the mortgage she'd been counting on. Daniel's tone was quieter, but no less biting. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you thank us." 3 days later, all three of them appeared at my doorstep, their faces drawn with indignation. They didn't sit long before the accusations began. Richard accused me of being manipulated by outsiders. Caroline called me cold and unfeeling, saying I was abandoning my own blood. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. "You're punishing us for wanting to build better lives." "That's not fair, Mom." I listened without interrupting, my hands folded in my lap. When the storm finally broke, I spoke with the same calm I had learned from years of negotiating contracts. "Not one of you has asked me how I am. Not one of you has asked if I am lonely or if I am happy. The only thing you've asked is how much I can give." The words hung in the air like a gavel's strike. Their faces faltered, but pride kept them from admitting the truth. When they left that evening, slamming the door behind them, the silence in my house felt heavier than it ever had before. The days that followed were eerily quiet. My phone, once buzzing with constant requests and updates, rarely rang anymore. When it did, the conversations were short, clipped, and heavy with unspoken blame. My grandchildren stopped calling altogether, their voices replaced by silence that seeped into the corners of my house. For the first time in decades, I felt the weight of true isolation. At night, I would lie awake listening to the creak of the old floorboards, wondering if I had gone too far. Doubt whispered to me in the dark. Was I punishing them, or was I finally protecting myself? But by morning, clarity returned. What kind of love depended on the balance of a bank account? To quiet the emptiness, I began venturing outside my routines. I joined a local book club at the library where women my age gathered not to ask for favors, but to share stories and laughter. On Tuesdays, I volunteered at a nearby senior center, serving meals and sitting with residents who rarely had visitors. Their gratitude was humble and unpolished, and in their company, I found something I hadn't felt in years: authenticity. One afternoon, I held the hand of a woman who told me her children hadn't visited in over 2 years. The sadness in her eyes mirrored the ache in my own heart, but there was also resilience there. "We still have each other," she whispered, and I realized she was right. Family could be chosen, created, nurtured outside of bloodlines. The loneliness didn't disappear overnight, but it softened. I began to see that stepping away from my children's demands had opened space for something new, and as that space filled with real connection, the idea of turning my foundation into a lifeline for others grew stronger until it was no longer just an idea. The day the foundation was launched, I stood in a modest community hall, decorated with nothing more than folding chairs and fresh flowers from a local garden. It was not extravagant, but it was honest, and that was all I wanted. The mayor offered a few words of support, and a reporter from the local paper took notes as I explained the mission to provide housing care and companionship for elderly men and women who'd been left behind by their families. When the ribbon was cut, applause filled the room. I watched as volunteers and staff greeted the first residents, men and women whose stories echoed pieces of my own. One gentleman clasped my hand tightly, tears welling in his eyes as he whispered, "Thank you for remembering us." In that moment, I felt something stir inside me, something no investment pitch or financial return could ever match. The local press ran the story the next morning, and within days, donations began to flow in. Friends I hadn't heard from in years called to congratulate me. Strangers sent letters sharing their own painful experiences of abandonment and gratitude that someone was doing something about it. My name was no longer tied to wealth or business, but to dignity, to second chances, to hope. Meanwhile, my children stayed silent. I knew they had read the articles. Their neighbors surely mentioned them. But the silence was no longer a wound, it was a boundary. I had stopped waiting for their approval and started living for something larger than all of us. As I left the hall that evening, the late sun cast the sky in strokes of gold and rose. I breathed deeply, feeling lighter than I had in years. This was not just survival, it was renewal, and it was only the beginning. I often returned to the coast, to the little house my husband and I once dreamed of retiring in. The air smells of salt and pine, and when the sun begins its descent, the horizon turns a deep orange that seems to stretch forever. I sit on the porch with a blanket draped over my lap, listening to the gulls cry as the waves roll in, steady and sure. It is in those moments that I remember the lobby, the polished marble, the echo of footsteps, the hollow silence after I realized my family had left me. For a long time, that memory carried only pain, the sting of rejection so sharp it stole my breath. But now, when it comes back to me, it feels different. That day was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of my freedom. I once believed love meant giving without limit, sacrificing without question. But love without respect is only exploitation. My children may never understand the depth of what they lost when they walked away from me that morning, but I understand what I gained. I claimed my dignity. I reclaimed my voice. And I learned that family in its truest form is built on presence, not profit. The foundation thrives the lives it touches, a testament to what can grow from broken soil. I see resilience in the faces of those we help, and in them I find a reflection of myself, not abandoned, but renewed. As the sky darkens and the first stars appear, I feel no bitterness, only a quiet certainty that I made the right choice. They left me in that hotel lobby, but I walked out with something they could never take: my resolve, my heart, and the wealth I chose to give where it mattered most.